Thanks, Alison. Go to Rushanara, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I've got some follow-up questions and then some questions about the long term in relation to unemployment. Just to pick up on those questions, the points about the excluded, this committee identified 1 million people, and some estimates go as far as 3 million. So would you say in the last, just starting with Rain, given the last few months, those who've been excluded have had very little support? Would you say that going forward, the government needs to look much more carefully at providing targeted support? The Chancellor's talked about the fact that the average income is 200,000, which is misleading because there are, as you say, there are some people who have by necessity had to work in a self-employed way and do not earn a great deal. Would you say that there needs to be a package of support overall to that group that are that are struggling?
Yeah, I absolutely think, the job is to look at, who is falling through the cracks, who hasn't been provided any support, and whether that's businesses or self-employed. I think the same principle applies, is trying to determine which businesses or individuals have been hardest hit, and then targeting support at that. But I do think it does need to be support, particularly from here on in, has to be targeted at those on lower incomes. I think if you look across the income distribution, what we do know is almost every sort of percentile has been hit by lower incomes. But what we've seen at people under, earning under 20,000, they're much more likely to have, to run down their savings, and they have much fewer savings to start with. So
I've got quite a few questions, so I'm gonna ask for brief answers, but I hope that way I can get as many of you in as possible. So Rain, earlier on you said that the economic recovery, we kind of saw a rapid recovery. How sustainable is that? And given where we are in terms of a second wave, and what can we learn from what's happened going forward so that we don't end up in this stop-start way? This will be a wider question for others as well. To what extent does some of the issues around the mismanagement around testing and contact tracing and the stop-start approach to the health crisis and how that's managed, and mixed messages and lockdowns and differences and misunderstandings or confusion about what needs to happen, how has that impacted on the economy? And I'd like everyone to briefly address that point, please, and then I want to go on to the long-term issues. Rain, perhaps if you could.
I'll try and be as brief as possible. I think, look, on the economic recovery, I think, the overall recovery in output has happened more faster than maybe some of our worst fears back in the spring. But I think we all know we're not out of the woods yet, and everyone is very worried about the winter months. So this isn't a V-shape. We will all carry the scars of this crisis. So absolutely, we need to minimize the impact on unemployment. I think, to your question specifically, one of the most important things the government can do is get a testing system up and running that people has confidence that works around the country. We know that is so vital for our schools, our universities, our businesses, and wider consumer confidence. So absolutely.
If you had to put a number on it, how much of an impact is that making in terms of, has the CBI done some number crunching on what the...
I can't give you any sort of quantification of the impact, but I think everyone recognizes there are numerous examples of the impact it's had in terms of people needing to self-isolate unnecessarily because they haven't been able to get a test to determine whether they have COVID or not. I know many stories.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on.
The only other thing, just very briefly, is I think when restrictions are announced, economic support should go hand in hand. Okay. And finally, on testing, where it is restricted, we absolutely need to prioritise the NHS, our enablers around transport and education. So I think there's more that could be done around prioritising the testing to the enablers across our wider economy.
Thank you very much. If others could add further points as opposed to any repetition. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just on the test and trace point, I mean, I think this has been one of the big failures of government policy over the last few months, and I'd pick up a couple of issues, Rushanara. First of all, too many people literally couldn't afford to self-isolate, and we made that case that 2 million people weren't even entitled to statutory sick pay. Those who were entitled to statutory sick pay, quite often that's all they were entitled to, and people making that difficult choice between paying the bills and following the government's guidance. Now, the £500 one-off payment helps, but it's not enough, and we want the government to pay a proper level of sick pay equivalent to the national living wage. Big failures, I think, in terms of, we haven't had a comprehensive programme of mass testing or workplace testing. And I sit on the DCMS Cultural Renewal Task Force, and one of the things I raised at that group a number of months ago was the value in having venue testing, for example, and to allow us to open up venues and to give people confidence they can go back to venues. Not all of this costs money. One of the things we asked the government to do was put a legal obligation on employers to publish their risk assessments, their COVID-19 risk assessments. Now, the government's guidance says that employers are expected to, certainly employers with more than 50 staff. Actually, it would have cost the government nothing to advise employers to publish those risk assessments. It's something that employers are legally obliged to carry out anyway, and it would go a long way towards giving people confidence that the pub, the business that they go into, they've done the right things and have put in place measures to protect customers and staff. And now, I say that doesn't cost anything at all. Employers have to produce these risk assessments anyway. The government could have just asked people to publish them on their website. And I can guarantee you, where we've had outbreaks, whether it be in farms or meat processing plants or in those sweatshops in Leicester and other parts of the country, employers won't have published those risk assessments. Third thing, just though, very quickly, Rushanara, I can't go into the answer properly, but I do think government needs to do more to sort of boost the economy over the next few months, and maybe we'll get into this in more answers. But we've called, for example, for a big investment in our green infrastructure.
Brilliant. So I've got a further question for you, which is to what extent do you think that which groups are most likely to face long-term structural unemployment, and what's the impact in terms of the pay gap on the impact on women, but also the pay gap on women? Are we likely to see a widening of that? And anything you can say about regional inequalities? How deep are those inequalities likely to get? Apologies, very quickly, because I want the others to come in.
Just to say, and we can provide further evidence if it's useful, but the experience of the last big recession was that the groups that you would expect to suffer disproportionate impact did. Black and ethnic minority workers facing higher unemployment and higher rates of unemployment, disabled workers finding it difficult to return to the labour market, women in particular, and that sort of interplay between childcare and work, really important and really problematic during the course of the lockdown. And obviously young people who we know were 2.5 times more likely to work in sectors of the economy that had to lock down. I am worried about the regional inequalities because we do have vacancies in the UK job market, but those vacancies aren't quite often in the places where people are losing their jobs. And that's why I do think the government needs to have a more comprehensive, integrated approach to what happens with the economy over the next few months. We've called for the establishment of a national recovery council, employers, unions, government, local authorities working together to try and work our way through these issues and to smooth that transition as much as we possibly can over the next.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Kate. Kate, can you just pick up on any of those points?
Yes, I'll try and amplify rather than repeating any of them. I think one of the key messages that we've been talking to government about it is how fast hospitality can react to any increase in demand, any uptick in the economy. Hospitality is one of the fastest sectors of the economy to recruit and to create jobs and to rebuild. So after the financial crash in 2010, in the whole decade since then, hospitality generated 1 in 6 of all net new jobs. 50% of our employment is 18 to 24-year-olds, 60% of our employment is women. So actually you're immediately seeing an impact on those more disadvantaged groups as a result of restriction on what hospitality can do. So we're usually first in, but we can be first out and rapid responder. And in terms of regional inequalities, clearly you've got large amounts of tourism and hospitality employment that is centred in those areas that are on the fringes of the country, on coastal communities, where there is not a great deal of other employment opportunities around. We go from being sort of 1 in 10 of all employment to 1 in 5. So we're disproportionately represented in those communities and those areas that have bigger challenges in terms of employment. In terms of your earlier question about mixed messages and confusion, I think that that's where hospitality is first into any crisis, because we are obviously hit when there is any damage to consumer confidence or any uncertainty or any confusion of messaging. Hospitality takes an impact. So in the last 2 weeks alone, what we saw as a result of the announcements from the Prime Minister and the Chief Medical Officer, you saw an immediate impact, not just on those areas that were directly affected by the curfew, but more broadly across hotels, holiday parks, those kind of bookings. So 50% increase in cancellations in pre-booked hotel rooms, visitor attractions. You've got sales down immediately, 18 to 24% week on week, 30% to 50% year on year, depending on which sector of the economy. So that's not just the restrictions on trade, that's the hit on consumer confidence. And while we were able to play our part July, August, early September in that rapid recovery as demand increased, we've also been hit quite severely and knocked back as a result of the recent changes and changes in legislation. So I think, yes, as Paul says, testing, tracing, if we are going to reopen those closed parts of our economy, events, conferences, nightclubs, live music venues, which are all a vital part of hospitality, they are the ones that are anticipating the largest numbers of redundancies over the next few weeks, and the highest level of business failure. And the testing and tracing and having an effective scheme will be vital to get those largest sectors up and running and open again.
Thank you. Tej, can you just pick up on any, I think I've overrun with my time, apologies, but if you could pick up on any of those points.
Sure. I mean, on the terms of the health response, I mean, business leaders obviously understand that, health and response to the pandemic comes first. I do think, nonetheless, there have been some hiccups in the kind of response that have affected businesses' ability to kind of open up effectively. I think the main one to highlight, and not to repeat anything that's already been said, is just generally around communications. I think, at the end of summer, we had a big communications plan around returning to the office, whereas I think a lot of businesses were wondering, what the case numbers were and whether we'd actually have to quickly go back into restrictions and lockdowns. And I think that the communications element is key to help business leaders plan their hiring and investment plans. And I think that has been a bit weaker than we would have liked. On the regional inequalities, it is definitely the case that some of the impact of coronavirus has mapped on to existing regional weaknesses. So, for example, rural and coastal areas have been, disproportionately impacted because of the impact of tourism has been limited in these areas. And then in some inner city areas in the north and in Scotland, for example, that are very dependent on hospitality, there's also been a major impact there. I think there's also some research to suggest that businesses outside of London are more likely to be holding unsustainable debt as a result of the pandemic. But generally speaking, I think across the board, it's very difficult to detect whether it's kind of going to exacerbate those inequalities, because obviously places like London and the South East have been equally affected at the same time.
Thank you very much.